getting delayed. It still hasn't come.
Okay. Let me introduce today's speaker. First of all, welcome to our first science education seminar series for the semester. My name is Sivan Karel. I'm a Helmsley postdoctoral teaching scholar in physics. So let me introduce our speaker for today. Dr. Tracie Addy is the Howard Hughes Medical Institute Director at the Yale Center for Teaching and Learning. She received her undergraduate degree from Duke University. She obtained her master's in experimental pathology from Yale and PhD in science education from North Carolina State. She taught undergraduate biology for 10 years and managed assessment programs at Yale School of Medicine and Technology Yale School of Medicine Teaching and Learning Center. Dr. Addy also has interest in writing science, undergraduate science cases and conducting educational research. She has mentored students from groups that are historically underrepresented in STEM fields. And it is our distinguished pleasure to have our own Dr. Tracie Addy give a talk titled Reflective Teaching, How We Can Assess Instructional Practices and Learn from the Process. Thank you very much. Let's give a warm welcome.
Thank you for the introduction. Thank you all for coming today. I hope you get a lot out of this seminar today. So I'm talking about a topic that I've keenly been interested in since I did my dissertation work. And it's thinking about, like, what do we think about teaching and why do we do what we do in the classroom? And how can we move the field forward into thinking about teaching and learning in that way? So I'm going to give you, like, the little outline of my talk. I also have, if you look on the board, it says, please write on the note card some ideas for that question. What are some tools you can use to be reflective teachers? So if you could write some ideas too, if you haven't already, that would be great. We're going to get to that in a little bit. So first I'm going to define or operationalize reflective teaching and what do I mean by it. And then I'm going to take it from 3 vantage points here. So what are my own teaching beliefs if I am an instructor, okay, and my practices, and how can I assess them? To what do we know about the teaching beliefs of current and future faculty? And this will be largely in the work that I've done, so some of my studies here. And then how can we encourage current and future faculty to be more reflective on their teaching and their practices in the classroom? So first, what is reflective teaching? So can somebody tell me a little bit, I have to have this a little bit interactive, what does reflective teaching mean to you? You're a reflective teacher. Yes?
So I'm fairly new to thinking about teaching, and my understanding about reflective teaching would be the fact that you're actually thinking about your interaction with your students in the classroom on a daily basis. So not just going in there and disseminating the material, but thinking about how you'll disseminate it and kind of the way it will be received, and then process that back again.
Okay, thank you. And others, I saw another hand.
Mostly agree with you about it. It's like in contrast to students who have metacognition, they analyze how they're learning. You're not just teaching, you're also analyzing how you're teaching.
Okay, another good analogy. Any others like to share reflective teaching? What does it mean to you? Yes.
Finding sources to bounce your ideas off of, your teaching ideas, so peers and colleagues and supervisors.
So a way to actually be reflective with other
Yeah.
people. Okay. And more.
Reflection including the student as part of the path back.
Talk a little bit more about that. What do you mean by that?
I teach, by the way. That's my job. So I can think about what I'm doing, but if I'm not listening to the student, I'm my own self-reflector, which is not necessarily a good idea, but if I can listen to the student and they say whether something worked, didn't work, or I see it in their face, but it's come through their thinking back to me.
Okay, so getting feedback, and we can see in all of these definitions it encompasses what, exactly what I'm thinking. You can get feedback on your own self, you can talk to others about, your teaching, you can listen to feedback from your students. So when I talk about reflective teaching here, I'm thinking about how do we examine our classroom teaching, why do I do it, and how can I improve it? Okay, so that's the other element of it. So in thinking about our teaching, we actually have underlying beliefs about teaching. Like, why do we teach the way we do? How do students learn? And I think we all harbor these beliefs, and they're pretty diverse. So much of my research and my dissertation, and some of it after, has looked at this, looked at beliefs and what we do in the classroom, and kind of the intersection between the two. Okay, so why reflective teaching? Well, we're going to get insight into why do we teach what we do. If we never think about what we teach and how we teach, then we're not really using that metacognitive, I heard that term come up, pathway to really think about our teaching. It captures our practices from multiple angles. So we mentioned student feedback, my own feedback, and other people's feedback on my teaching. I can use that, all of that. And then I can think about, how do I change in the future? So maybe I get feedback on my evaluations, I get feedback from my peers, maybe they come and observe my teaching, or from anyone else. And I think about, well, how can I use this to actually change instruction if I should? Okay, change instruction. So here are the 3 levels that I currently kind of outlined. What are my own beliefs? So looking in the mirror, okay, what do I think about teaching and learning? And what do we know in the field? And again, here I'm not going through a whole, we don't have time to do that, but I'll talk about a couple of studies I've done. And then how can we encourage current and future faculty to reflect on their teaching? So these are the 3 levels that I mentioned earlier. So first I wanted to focus on me, okay, or the instructor. So what are my own teaching beliefs and practices, and how can I assess them? All right, you got a little note card. I asked you to write down some ideas. I'd love to hear, what are some tools we can use to be reflective teachers? What are some ideas we have? Yes, Jimmy.
Observations, both of other people teaching, but inviting someone to watch you.
Okay. Observational feedback is one way.
Journals, so keeping a running track of what worked, what didn't work after classes.
Okay, excellent. Journals.
So one can send surveys to students and assess what the survey says,
Okay, so
adapting and modifying adjusting.
getting feedback from students, good, in terms of surveys, evaluations.
Student evaluations, which is similar, but also enrollment.
Talk a little more about that.
Students talk, and so if someone in a college took a great course, they're going to then happen to be maybe a freshman advisor and talk about it. Enrollments might go up for that course following years.
Okay. So you can kind of see the product of your teaching, right? So more students, take your class, and it gets more popular. Okay. All right, great. So I'm just going to highlight, you mentioned several of these already, but I'm just going to talk about each of them a little bit briefly. Okay, so teaching reflection journals, I heard about that a little bit. The review of the student evals, teaching inventories, as well as looking at our own teaching practices. So we could actually record ourselves, although it's sometimes painful to look at yourself. I don't know if I want to see this video. So sometimes that's also a good method of looking at our own teaching. Also peer and departmental feedback. So we talked about somebody coming into your class and observing it. And of course, we're in the Center for Teaching and Learning. So there are teams of people here that can observe you and give you feedback on your classroom. So first, teaching reflection journal. Has anyone ever tried this? If you have, can you raise your hand? Okay, so very few people, okay. So what is a teaching reflection journal? Well, we're thinking about after class, soon after class, hopefully. It takes a lot of discipline to do a teaching journal because after class you're often feeling like, okay, I'm done, now prepare for the next class. But this is this process of having some form, whether it's a physical journal notebook, whether it's digitally, and reflecting on questions, which can be diverse in terms of what you ask yourself, but what went well, what could I have done differently, and how can I modify it in the future? And just any general notes, right, to write about your actual class. So the great thing about journals, we can look at our progress, right? So we can actually look over the course of the semester if we're disciplined enough to write about our teaching, and we can actually see how we've changed or improved over time. And we can also look when we want to revamp our course at our journal entries. Another way to think about reflection journal, and I heard talking to colleagues or hearing from other people, we can form learning communities with our colleagues and discuss our reflections and our progress. And I actually met with several faculty today, and several of them said, oh, I'd love to just talk with my colleagues about our teaching. Okay, so this is a very powerful way to be reflective on our own teaching. Now, feedback, we all know, students, they rate you, okay, and then evaluations, sometimes some can be controversial, right? What feedback do they give you? How are they designed? And all these other matters. But what we can do with evaluations, midterm and end of term, is look at the major themes, okay? So if one student says something, okay, your class is horrible. Well, maybe it was, but we really want to look at themes, okay? So are many students saying something, and are these themes congruent with my own personal reflections? So, kind of triangulating it with our own reflections ourselves. And what can I consider in modifying my future instruction? So student feedback and evaluation of it is another powerful way to consider our own reflection. So the other area that I wanted to talk about a little bit more, and getting more into what kinds of protocols we can actually use to reflect on our teaching, is observation protocols versus like a teaching inventory. And as you can imagine, they have their pluses and minuses, advantages and disadvantages. I outlined a few here. An observational protocol is basically a list. It's usually like a document where they're all created in different ways. They can look at a particular pedagogy. They can just assess what you're doing in the class in general every few minutes, and I'll give a few examples. But these ones involve an actual classroom observation or looking at a video of teaching, so actually looking at teaching. So that's a huge advantage. Getting external feedback is huge, right? So I can get feedback from other people when I do an observation, usually an observation protocol, and I can self-assess myself. So if I video record my own teaching, I can look at the video. I could actually use the observational protocol if I desired. Now, observational protocols are interesting. So you'll later see I use them in my research. My research, the observational protocol that I use, is actually more of a research protocol. It's not necessarily for sharing it with faculty, okay? But we can. But it's it can impose some awkwardness if it looks at a specific pedagogy. So these are getting into some of the disadvantages. Oftentimes, training is required if you're going to publish it. You have to have inter-rater reliability, multiple people looking at it, etc. And it provides only a snapshot view. Unless you see the instructor multiple times over the course of the semester, you're really only getting a picture of one course, okay? So those are some of the disadvantages. Now, teaching inventories typically doesn't involve much training. You're just basically going to fill it out. It's often quicker, and it's self-report. So that could be a good thing, but also the disadvantage is self-report can be inaccurate, right? Okay, so maybe I think I'm doing this in my class, but maybe I'm not. So having multiple levels in reflective teaching is huge. Okay, so not just the inventory, but also feedback from students, also my own reflections as well. And some of them may show evidence of quantity, like what percentage of the time am I lecturing in class, but not the quality, or what percentage of the time, better said, group work in class. I'm going to be more student-centered. So it might not tell me how well the students are working in groups, just that they are working in groups. So there's advantages and disadvantages to both. And what I want to just refer you to, if you want like a tool, ASBMB has a whole a website, and they have a whole bunch of teaching practice instruments that you can actually go to, and you can just look them up. Okay, most all of them are like validated, reliable tools. So just consider that. Okay, if you want like a little tool there. Now here's a list of a few, and I'm going to talk about this one that I've used in my research, which is the Reformed Teaching Observation Protocol. It's called RTOP. And I know it has mixed thoughts about it in the community just because it is a tool that's used for research. So it's used to measure student-centered or teacher-centered practices. So again, we typically would not share that with the instructor unless they wanted to know that information. So it does put a judgment on the teaching in some way. And there's a whole bunch of other ones. If you look at, especially in STEM, there's TDOP, the COPUS, and all of these number of other ones. I've also used this in some of my research, and this one, you'll see that in a little bit. Okay, so let's look at an example. So this is one observation protocol, and it is called the Classroom Observation Protocol for Undergraduate STEM. So this is a particular protocol that's been used in STEM education. And one thing that it addresses that's different than the RTOP is the RTOP is, again, posing a judgment, where the COPUS, they tried to make the question so that it didn't do that. I want you to look at some feedback and results, and then I'm going to have you do a little exercise. So if you look at this, they give you these pie charts, right? So the COPUS says, what are the students doing? What are the instructors doing? And you basically use codes every 2 minutes of class, and you basically say, what are they doing? Okay, what are each of these groups doing? Are they listening, if they're students, individual thinking, clickers, etc.? And then for the lecture, for the instructor, are they lecturing, etc.? Okay, so this is a lecture-based course that I'm showing here. So in the lecture-based course, what are the students mostly doing? Listening, okay? A little bit of time is devoted to students asking questions. And how about what is the instructor doing? Lecturing, okay, most of the time, makes sense, okay? So answering questions and then some follow-up also might happen. But if we look at our chart, right, it's a small percent of the time. Okay, so question. Pair up with someone next to you. I want you to think about I'll give 3 minutes, okay? So predict how this pie chart, these two, would differ in an active learning classroom. So a classroom where students are doing small group work, maybe as an example of active learning, okay? So talk to someone next to you. Think about how it would be.
The three of us. Three's fine.
Okay.
That's my wife. So. I'll let you guys know.
Well, we both work with Tracie.
Okay, so they were actually
far less, far more answering questions, real time.
It's new crop seed, and she plants now the see what's the best way to grow that crop. Tell the farmers start growing this crop. This type of fertilizer.
Actually, the student asking a question might not be about the situation they might want.
And she puts time well, get data and concept that and that the machine works, that you can see actual differences between two different so we can all see our species, try different times of day, try different environmental conditions across the summer, different times during the and then she would help. I can work with some lunch, going forward, I can define all my own, because it's too late for me to do my straight try to my own aspect and they're almost just kind of be like a picture of how to do these right, I don't think that's randomized the right way or statistics I think that would be a publication that could come still longer than my data. Rose was sort of you get higher yield. And I would say, well, you get higher yield because
so how do you think the pie charts would change? Who would be going to volunteer their answer? So what would the students, what the students are doing look like? Hypothetically, obviously we have many forms of these pie charts that can come out. But what would you tend to see compared to what's there now?
More diversity.
Yeah. Yes. So the pie chart would be definitely, probably likely more colorful, okay, because you'd have more different types of things. So students aren't going to only be listening, right? They're going to be probably thinking a little bit. They might be doing group work. They might be, might be asking a question here and there, okay? How about the instructors? What would their pie chart change to? What would it look like more of?
A lot of purple.
A lot of purple? Okay, so, if they were posing questions, okay, so they could be potentially posing questions, and it would just in general be a little bit more colorful. So this is a course, for example, that might utilize a lot of different active learning techniques, okay? So you see diversity in this pie chart. What's going on here with the students? A lot of individual thinking. Only a portion of the time is listening, but it's there, right? I mean, students are still having time to listen, and the instructor is still lecturing, right, a little bit in that active learning classroom. There's also clicker questions, group work, etc. The instructor pie chart also changes a little bit. Look at this, one-on-one discussions with students, okay, whereas largely lecture here. So the whole point in looking at this is thinking about, well, we can actually look at what we're doing in the classroom, right? And we can actually analyze it and assess it by using these different types of protocols. And what might change over time in different classrooms, we'll see different patterns, okay? Especially here in this, example of this pie chart. Okay, so what I wanted to do was transition now into what do we know about teaching beliefs and practices of faculty and future faculty. So I did some studies during my dissertation time around graduate teaching assistants as well as faculty, in particular populations of them. So what I'm going to present here is basically some of that research. Now, a lot of this is based in theory. That's how we're trained in science ed. Okay, so all of my research is based in some types of theory or conceptions, and one of the major ones here is that teaching beliefs have the ability to inform classroom practices. So what we think about our teaching has the ability to influence what we do, but it's messy, right? It's not necessarily going to be a one-to-one ratio, okay, of what I think is what I do. And that's the interesting juxtaposition that I've been really interested in. Why is that? Okay, why do I believe something or not? And why don't I do it in the classroom or not? Okay, so that's Nesper's conceptions. Now, when I've done my work, we've worked hard to think about how can we categorize these things? What tools can we use to capture somebody's beliefs about teaching? Okay, because that's a very broad thing. What do you believe about teaching? Okay, very broad area. So we focused our attention on looking at what is student-centered versus teacher-centered on a continuum. Okay, and we know that a lot of instructors might actually hold diverse beliefs. So some of them might fall within the realm of kind of traditional in a certain context, and some of them might be more what we call reform-based. So you can kind of see all of these different categories and looking at beliefs. Now, how did I usually capture this? Well, it took a lot of work, a lot of qualitative work, okay? So I interviewed faculty, future faculty, and using like a semi-structured, we call this semi-structured because I do have the questions, okay, that guide, and we prompt them as needed. And interviewing them, transcribing, okay, looking at what they said, digging deep into it, and categorizing them. Okay. So these are the questions that Luft and Rohrig put together. They've been validated questions in looking at beliefs. And so how do you maximize student learning in your classroom? How do you describe your role as an instructor? How do you know when your students understand? So these are really getting at deeper questions about what do I really think about how my students learn best? Okay, more than just, I'm going to teach class today. Now I'm really thinking deep about this, okay? So as you can imagine, different populations respond different ways to this. Some of the faculty that I interviewed, they've been thinking about this forever. So, their interview could take a whole hour and a half, okay, getting through all this. Whereas some who haven't maybe reflected upon it as much might take about 20 minutes, okay, to go through this protocol. Okay, so what do I mean by these categories? Now, I'm not going to read, individually, but you can kind of imagine that traditional would mean my role as an instructor is to deliver information. So we call that sage on the stage. There's all these terms for that. So some faculty or students might have traditional beliefs about things. Instructive is more about what experiences can I provide? Maybe I want to provide course outlines and things like that for my students, which is all very good. But those are more instructive, and instructive would mean it doesn't go beyond that. Right? So you're not seeing this level. Transitional is right in between, and these instructors, they typically are like, I want to have good relationships with my students, right? But and I want to help them understand, but there's kind of not more than that, okay? So, but it's, they care, they want to have good relationships. Responsive is focusing, well, we'll get our students to work together in teams. We'll think about how they can take ownership of their learning. But we're not as far as reform-based. This is a category that not many people fall in, as you can imagine, but focusing on mediating student knowledge and interaction. So the teacher will change their instruction based upon the response and the feedback that they get from the students. And this whole classroom environment is set up in that type of fashion. So can you imagine, just a question, if you take a typical well, I can't say typical maybe, we'll just say a science classroom at the undergraduate level, where do you think many of the beliefs of professors might lie? Which categories? And this is just fun, no right answer. Transitional? Okay, so you think a lot of them transitional from your experience? Okay. And maybe also, too, think about your own beliefs. Okay, where would you fall, right, on this spectrum, okay, of beliefs? Okay, so I'm just going to give, I'm not going to read through all these, I'm just going to give an example. These are examples that come from the research, like what the faculty actually said, okay? So this one, let's say instructive, I feel like I use 3 methods, and it's a lot of repetition in terms of the facts that I'm saying. You say, I say it, I write it, I show it, and then a lot of times we'll use the outlines on the retest where I'll have them yell out the answers. So you can see the instructor is focused on providing these outlines and delivery of this information in this way, repeating the information. So taking mostly an instructive approach, okay, to teaching. All right, so let's look at some studies. Okay, so the first one was with graduate teaching assistants. And here at Yale, they're called graduate fellows. Are you called graduate fellows? Okay, so this is the language that we tend to use. So just when I say graduate teaching assistant, that's basically what I mean. So what I wanted to do, I worked with a certificate program for graduate students when I was doing my dissertation work. And I was really intrigued by this program because the faculty member who led it, she really wanted to collaborate with the Center for Teaching and Learning. And she wanted to train the new, upcoming graduate students on informed teaching, like student-centered teaching, okay, type practices. So I was like, well, this is a ripe case study. I like case studies. So I like, kind of seeing what happens in that case. So I asked, what are their beliefs about teaching? What are their practices? Do their beliefs differ from one another? And do their teaching beliefs correspond to their practices? So this is very bound in a specific group of graduate teaching assistants who were motivated enough to enroll themselves right in a teaching course, okay? There were 8 of them. They were pursuing a master's or PhD in some life sciences. You'll see their demographics. They taught laboratory sections for introductory biology. So here they are. I gave them all pseudonyms. You have to do that. I can't say the real name. But Dr. Maria, she was the actual director of the course. She's the main faculty member. And then there are all these are all the graduate teaching assistants. And you can see they're diverse in terms of their race, ethnicity. They're diverse in terms of female, male. Age, probably they're a similar range of age. And their teaching experiences differ, but this one by far I think outweighed the others, the 5 years of previous teaching experience. And they have a wide variety of different fields that they were going into. Okay, so here are their beliefs. So when we capture their beliefs, again, it's a process. We interview them, we transcribe their interviews, then I come together and co-authors help with actually doing iterative reliability. We agree upon their belief categories for every single question, and we come up with that kind of system. So if you look at all their questions, each question has asterisks, basically. Okay, that's how this is designed. And we consider this kind of like a profile, a beliefs profile. So the one thing I was really curious about, and I almost didn't get her, but I was like, oh, Dr. Maria, she's teaching this reform-based course. I want to suggest she have reform-based, actual beliefs, because that would be really interesting if she did it, wouldn't it? But if you look here, hers are definitely more, to the right skew there, okay, transitional and beyond. Now, if you look at the graduate teaching assistants, their beliefs are pretty much, towards the left side, right? Transitional and below, but you can see that most of them are transitional and a lot of instructive beliefs as well. So I thought that was kind of interesting. Several of them agreed to me looking at their class. We actually, the great thing about this course, this teaching certificate program, was they had to do an observation of their peer, they had to record it, and they had to self-reflect, and their peer had to give them feedback. So I had a ripe opportunity to get their videos and just ask them, can I have your teaching video, and then to actually score it. So these were the ones that agreed. And I used the RTOP on them, and the RTOP varies from 0 to 100. 100 is more student-centered. And as you can see, most of their RTOP scores, even though they were teaching, by the way, a laboratory course, okay? So that's a lot of group work and interaction, right, between students and whatnot. But their RTOP scores actually fell mostly on the less student-centered kind of side. So that was an interesting kind of study. We're thinking about, well, yeah, their beliefs could be like mostly transitional, pushing over to this reform-minded after this program. Who knows? I didn't do before the program. I wish I could have, but that would have been nice. But if you look at their practices, they're fairly skewed and more teachers. Yes.
Sorry, Tracy.
Sure.
No,
No, feel free to
was it
do it.
Malbec or Camille that had the most?
Malbec.
And
Yes, she had 5 years of teaching experience. That's a good
of
question.
course, this is just 2 people, but so Malbec and Camille, was there a reason why they didn't want you to observe them, or it just worked out that way? I mean, like,
Yeah,
it
so
seems
when we do these
silly.
studies, we just say, do you want to? And if not, we don't really ask.
Kind
So
of weird,
I don't-
because
that's
they
a
were
good
the
question.
most student-centered, and they also had a lot of, or at least
Yeah.
she had a lot of experience.
And also they're busy, they have busy lives and they're, in school, and so, I don't know why she didn't, or they didn't. It's a good question, but I never did ask her. And I knew all these people, fairly well. I sat in on the program, so I knew who each of them were. So if we actually look a little bit further and dig deeper, the RTOP's divided into categories. So we can actually see their scores and how student-centered according to the categories of the RTOP. So one thing that's interesting is their propositional knowledge was a higher category out of this is 16 here. And student-teacher relationships were higher for them. Propositional knowledge is looking at, does the lesson promote conceptual understanding? And does the instructor have a solid foundation in the content? So it seemed like they felt good about the content. I mean, they're graduate students who are studying science, so it makes sense. So that was the higher. And then their student-teacher relationships also, they were higher ones of theirs. But lower was lesson design, procedural knowledge, and communicative interactions. So for this study, we dug a little bit deeper. We were trying to figure out, well, why is this? Why do they have transitional beliefs, but their practices are falling that way, especially in a laboratory course? So we ended up seeing that, well, it looks like curriculum. So we dug deeply into the curriculum and the way it was designed. It was hard for them to enact any student-centered kind of pedagogy. So this paper was called The Problem with Reform from the Bottom Up. So if we can give them programs and whatnot, but if we don't help change the curriculum, it's going to be really hard to actually see the practices, move towards that way. So that's one. Another one, this one actually, so Grant, he actually worked with me in another study. We went to graduate school together. He's a faculty member. He does a lot of science and research. He's in Tennessee. And he just submitted this, but I'm going to tell you, this is bulk of his work, that he did several years ago. He teaches biology graduate teaching assistants, and he wanted to look at their beliefs about teaching and learning. And so he wanted to compare them to novice K-12 teachers, because thinking about this is their first time teaching. Well, can we look at how they compare to a teacher who's first time teaching? So he was very interested in this intersection between these questions. Now, he had 15 of these GTAs. I guess I shouldn't say he did, but it's at a large southeastern university. I'm sure you could find him and figure out where it is. But they had a minimum of 1 year of teaching experience in the laboratory, and they had no training prior in pedagogy. So what Grant was looking at, he didn't measure practice as I did. Practice, obviously, it's a lot of time to measure to get faculty or students to want, to look at your courses, but he measured their beliefs. So he focused on these are 2 kind of established scales used in science education, but they comfort for science teaching, perceived need for students to learn science, their efficacy, and their outcome expectancy, and then looking at their perspectives on teaching and learning. So we could define all these. You can imagine comfort with science teaching. How comfortable do I feel with actually teaching the material at hand? Do I want my students to learn science? What is the perception of the GTA in this case? Do I believe I can do this, teach science in this way? And then the other one, which I find interesting, and the results are kind of interesting, is will the way I teach actually lead to effective learning? So that's the teaching outcome. So when Grant did this, and I just asked him this because I was like, oh wait, aren't these error bars? But he told me that these are the standard deviations of the error bars. So he compared them to K-12's teachers And if you look, the GTAs are there, and then the PSTs are the pre-service teachers, okay? So in looking at the data, the comfort for science teaching was higher among the GTAs, which makes sense. Pre-service teachers might not specialize in science, okay? So intuitively, that kind of makes sense. Their need for students to learn science, fairly the same. Their self-efficacy beliefs, belief in their ability to teach, science, was higher. And then their outcomes expectancy, actually the GTAs were lower than the teachers. Can anyone imagine why? Like, what could be some reasons for that? Just curious, like why would teachers have a higher outcome expectancy than the graduate teaching assistants?
Well, I guess maybe the courses they're teaching, if you're teaching intro lab, might be teaching people actually doing that, who would go into that later.
Okay.
People non-majors, I would guess.
Okay, so not everybody taking their course is necessarily going to continue in that field, okay? Yeah, so, and what we were thinking was, there's a lot of training that happens with pre-service teachers and teaching, and so they probably feel like, they have the training and it will lead to a result. And also the graduate teaching assistants, a lot of college is like, you just learn it and you move on, and so that's not necessarily that everybody's learning, right? So those were, some of the things that we thought could be happening here. The variation, if you look at their beliefs, this is shown in a different way, but these bars here represent the different categories of beliefs, and he was able to get 8 of them to do this, but most of them were in the transitional range, and this person would be the most traditional, so they have traditional beliefs and instructive, and then this person would be the most reform-minded, okay? So you can see there's variation. Most of them fell actually in the kind of the transitional category. And then lastly, he looked at their teaching perspectives. And so he looked like what they espoused primary. So there's a primary, secondary, and tertiary that you can examine by doing this survey instrument. And so the primary one seemed to be heaviest in the developmental perspective. So that was basically saying that instructors plan and teach from the learner's point of view. So most of them seem to espouse that perspective. So that was an interesting study as well. So the other study that I did most of my dissertation work on was with another specific population, and these were science faculty with education specialties. So if you saw or were here before, and it's okay if you weren't, but Kimberly Tanner, actually she did some work in this as well, so that's kind of how I knew her and got interested in it. So I wanted to actually look at a special population of faculty and a population that was invested in education efforts. So they self-identified as these science faculty with education specialties. They were hired for their specialty, they taught in a science department, and they taught science. Or they transitioned into an education-related role as a senior faculty member. Okay, so that's kind of how it's operationalized. So I wanted to know, well, I'm curious, like, if we look at these they were a growing number in the nation, what are their beliefs and what are their practices? And I wanted to find as many as I could, and just what do they believe about teaching? What are they practicing? What are they doing where they're at? And how can that impact their field in STEM education? So I ended up asking about 35, I think 25 of them from different universities agreed. And they represented 12 institutions in the US, mostly research. Only a few I think 2 were master's granted type institutions by Carnegie classifications. They were very diverse in terms of their backgrounds. They range from lecturer to full professor. And this is a group that you can't categorize them in one box, okay, because they are very, very diverse in what they teach and what they do. So that was the participants, and I wanted to do a little bit more triangulation of the data. So not only did I want to look at their beliefs, so I wanted to interview them and see what were their teaching beliefs. I also wanted to see what they self-reported as approaching as what they did in the classroom. What did they actually think they did in the classroom? And then actually observe them. I was hoping most of them would be willing to have me observe them, but many of them were, but not all of them. So what did we find? So if we actually look at their beliefs, and we could look at this in a lot of different ways, but this is a simplistic figure here. Most of them were transitional and beyond. So that's what I would hope for, for faculty who were hired with education specialties, that you're seeing that right shift in their actual beliefs. And when I asked them their approaches to teaching, they self-reported, this is a different scale, conceptual change student focus scores were higher than information transmission student teacher focus. So they actually believed, more student centered in their belief systems, and what they self-reported as their approaches, what they did in the classroom, was more student focused than teacher focused. Then if I actually look at their classroom practices, which was a neat endeavor, and some of them I just drove to. I said, can I look at your class and tape it? And I had to tape them all because I had to have inter-rater reliability, so I had to have my co-authors help me with that part. So some of them I was able to drive to, and I think 2 maybe gave me a video of their teaching. So if I look at the spectrum, the mean fell around 50. Our top goes from 0 to 100. 100 is more reform-based, and obviously it's really hard to get out 90s and 80s. I think that's really challenging, for most faculty at the university, college level, for STEM. And you can kind of see that most of them, on average, were right along the middle, okay, in general. I mean, there's some that were on either side of the spectrum. So when I looked at their beliefs, they seem to be more student-centered, okay? Looking at their approaches, seem to be more student-centered in this particular population, this sample. And again, I'm not making generalizations broadly. This is my case. This is bound in this context, okay? And then their practices were kind of like in between. So that begs the question of why is that, right? So why do they have these beliefs? Why can't they enact them? And there's a lot, that can be said, okay, about that in future directions in the field. So I also wanted to note that actually by doing this presentation, I noticed something. So when I was looking at the graphs a little bit, I noticed that if you compare the science faculty of education and their profile on the RTOP, so if you go by category, you actually see a similar pattern than my graduate teachers. I never even compared these before, but I just realized that. So, so this was a neat process for me, I guess. So you can see their propositional knowledges were the higher of the categories, and the student-teacher relationships, and maybe that for the graduate teaching assistants a little bit lower here, and maybe that makes sense. Thinking about scientists, pretty high knowledge, pretty confident in their ability to teach science, conceptual understanding. Same with graduate teachers, it's a little lower, right, there. And it's hard to compare them directly. They're not the same population, not the same number, but it's just an interesting pattern. The student-teacher relationships, I was curious as to those are a little bit higher than the, ones in the faculty, but the faculty, interestingly enough, were teaching lectures. The graduate teaching assistants were teaching labs. So I find it interesting that the patterns ended up being similar. Something to, I'll think about in the future. Okay, so lastly, okay, how can we encourage current and future faculty to reflect on their own teaching beliefs and practices? So we kind of went through this whole spectrum here and thinking about how can I as a teacher reflect on my own teaching, and we have some practical tools. And to what do we kind of know about what's happening in STEM in terms of the studies that I presented here, and we could definitely present many, many more studies on this topic. And also thinking about the future. So how can we do this? So obviously exposure. Okay, so if faculty know how to reflect, and many of you, seems like you've done some reflection here, and not everybody's faculty or graduate student or postdoc, but you can actually expose them to these tools and resources and encourage their usage. So that's number one. Okay, let's be reflective teachers. Let's think about our teaching practices a little bit more. Now, the other thing that came up in the research, especially with grad students, is it's not just what we believe in, what we think, and helping encourage that, but it's also how are our courses designed, right? So if there's those limiting factors of, well, I can't teach like that because of the pedagogy, the course or the curriculum is not aligned to this type of teaching, then we need to work with instructors to have both ends. And then just knowing a little bit more and pursuing more research and understanding what's happening. I mean, I'm curious now, I did this study these studies a little while ago, so I'm just curious as to now, what's happening in our field in terms of beliefs and practices. Are they changing in departments, or is it the same? Is it only particular faculty espousing student-centered beliefs about teaching and learning? Are we still seeing this kind of divide in what's happening in their classrooms? All right, okay, that's what I had a question. So these are all my references. And then I wanted to say thank you. And I'm happy to
you measure, say, grad students, they're all teaching the same graduate level course. Can you also, say, measure, you can map each TA's learning beliefs, teaching beliefs, style. Can you map that to the grades of the students? Like for physics, there's like common exams that you check out like their growth in the year. Maybe that can map well with their beliefs.
Yeah, I think that.
Hopefully you would see one way, but maybe not.
Yeah, I think that would be really interesting. I mean, to look at not just their beliefs of the person teaching and not just what they do, but look at their students and the actual outcomes of how they're doing in the class. I think that is a good point. I mean, that'd be great future work.
Chris's question is a little related to what I wanted to ask, which is how do you motivate faculty to want to be reflective teachers? And if we knew something about there's a benefit to students or your students will learn more, that would be a cool argument, but I'm not sure we have that data.
Yeah.
Do you have any experience with that?
Yeah, not necessarily, no. I mean, that's a good question. I mean, I think we want our faculty to think about their teaching a little bit more, and, you know, by exposing them only, it's, you know, we don't necessarily encourage them, but I mean, I see this as, you know, providing these experiences for either graduate teaching assistants, like these courses that can train you in what is you know, reflective teaching, how can I do it? And that's what these courses all did for the graduate teaching assistants. So that encourages them to actually, you know, seek it out more. For faculty, you know, I feel like you'd have to, they're a little different, a little bit more independent, but the ones that are motivated might, you know, be interested in that type of course or, you know, program or workshop, or just seeking out one-on-one also with faculty and forming these. I think one of the big things I would love to see more of is like these faculty learning kind of communities, where they actually talk about their teaching together with one another and people in their department or neighboring departments.
Okay, double different questions.
Sure.
So you listed, there are the 8 self-reflective questions that I guess you asked them as well.
Yeah.
Do those kind of questions, because you took the answers and you kind of pegged which one that was transitional, were any of them more of one type than the other? Is there any particular place that teachers were generally more transitional or more
So were any of who more? Any of who? Like,
or like the
any
questions
of the
themselves.
Oh, the questions.
Like was that one question?
I
Did it
see
end up
what you
being
mean,
more
yeah.
of one answer?
So did I analyze it by question, and did I
Well,
see
yeah.
certain
Did there any
patterns?
patterns in that?
Yeah, this is good. So this protocol, you know, I didn't show like how to rate. Maybe I can get to the actual questions again. But let's see. I think they're here. Okay.
Yeah.
So they're here. So you're asking like, how do I maximize student learning? Do I see more of them fall in traditional versus reform? Yeah, I don't think we didn't analyze it that way per se. But I remember there were trends that we would tend to see certain categories like come out more in certain questions, but we never really analyzed them in that way. We kind of just took the, you know, how the inventory, how it was, yeah. But I think that would be a good question to ask too. Yeah.
Any other questions? I'll let you add this, sorry.
Sure. I have a really general question. In your experience and in the field, are the teaching inventories reliable at all?
Well, some of them that are like in that site that I told you, they've been validated. So I only go with the ones, I mean, I would say the ones that have been validated and used by many professors and faculty and, you know, teaching assistants, yes. Many of them are. I mean, they all have, I think, people all have critiques to nearly every instrument or tool that you use, right? But the ones that have been validated have been, you know, used a lot in the field, and I've seen no issue with those. Like the approaches to teaching inventory sometimes gets critiqued, and that one I used in my research. But you know, they're measures at least a ballpark of where, you know, faculty are. I feel like that's a hard issue because like everything is critiqued, you know, in our field. So.
But by validated, do you mean that a professor does the inventory and then is observed, and actually they're observed doing what they say they're doing?
So I'm actually talking about the construction of the actual inventory or the protocol. So going through, and evaluation people know this probably very well, but when you create one of these instruments, you know, testing it out and making sure the statistics, everything's reliable, and well, that's a reliable measure, and also that it's valid, that's actually assessing what you want it to. So in terms of that, in my work, most of my work, I've only used those instruments that have that great, like, statistical validity and reliability. So that I would tend more towards those ones.
So I guess my question was, do GTAs or faculty report doing what they're observed doing? Do you know of?
Do they report, oh, they're self-report.
So, right, so the teaching
Yeah, so that
inventory
was-
are all self-report. I'm wondering,
Certainly.
are there any studies where they self-report and then they're observed? Or in your studies,
Mhm.
did you see?
The one study I did, they self-reported on their approaches, and then they talked about their practices, and then I did ask them in the context of that class, please do this survey for your approaches in the context of this particular class. I'm going to observe that particular class as well. So they kind of did them simultaneously, so that to increase the likelihood that they made, that was valid to actually do that. So in that case, their approaches were more student-centered, but their practices were kind of in between. So, they weren't actually necessarily saying what they were doing, but I think we'd have to dig deeper and do more analysis to really kind of hone in on each person and kind of what they said about their approach and what they said about their practices. I presented here the broad kind of general data. But that's a great question, because I think it's important, because self-report is not always reliable. And that's why I triangulated it. I wanted to actually see them and actually have them self-report.
So in the spirit of research, since the goal of, I guess, of the talk is to incentivize us to reflect more on our teaching as well, is there any study where, a group of people were doing great teaching journals, being observed, so they're really very engaging, reflecting on their teaching, and has some sort of test, some of these kind of teaching inventories at the beginning and at the end, so to give evidence that those reflections brought a, maybe a shift towards where they believe or stuff like that.
Yeah, so what I would say to that is, I don't know specific studies, but in K through 12, they do this work immensely, more than we can imagine, especially in reflective teaching, etc. So there's probably studies out there that have actually looked at reflective teaching, but I think we'd have to dig more in literature. In higher ed, I haven't seen that, I haven't seen that.
More questions?
Good questions. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I also sort of bouncing for that question. With regards to, I found it interesting that for the graduate teaching assistants, our top scores seem to match their opinions about what practices they put into place. They were sort of skewed to the left slightly, and their R top scores were skewed to the left. But for the faculty, it was skewed to the right, but the mean was centered though. And so I wondered if you thought that would suggest curriculum. And because I think for most, correct me if I'm wrong, most SFES faculty are usually, that's faculty that are at major research universities that have an education focus, but they also have to, I think, comply with a broader curriculum as well. So do you think it's mostly a curriculum, or do you think there's something fundamental about science that sort of, that keeps it from skewing to the right at our top score?
Sure, yeah, so the way the lab was designed, and it's a great experience, for the good experience for the students, but the particular lab actually taught it too. But it was more the way that the graduate teaching assistant had to go through kind of all of the material was a little bit more teacher-centered, and how it was designed. So it's hard, I guess it would be hard for them, and they're new teachers, right? So they're just teaching this, so they want to follow what they've been told to do. So it's harder for them to actually, deviate from that, and they're still learning, what does it mean to be student-centered, etc. So I think here in that particular case, yes, I do think that would play a role, but I also think they were early teachers, so I think they need more time, and they need more experiences teaching as well, and figuring out how to teach in this student-centered way. And maybe the approach, if they had a little bit more freedom and designed the curriculum, that also could have lent itself to more student-centered.
Is there any evidence coming through now from graduate teaching assistants who've experienced in the classroom the more recent approaches to teaching, and therefore being different in some way from those 10 years ago?
I think that's an interesting question. So you're referring to if they were taught using student-centered approaches, what are they doing now? I think this is a really good question. I don't think the literature is really any big answers to that, but it's an evolving area right now, because I know we definitely say that people tend to teach the way they were taught. So I think it will be very useful to actually see what happens with these students who actually are taught in this way. And I've always thought about that in my research, oh, could I capture those who actually have been taught in this way? But I haven't been able to find those, those individuals, you know, because most of science teaching, and these individuals come from many different countries even, right? So most of the science teaching is fairly traditional. So it's really hard to find that. But now, as the fields are changing and teaching is changing, I think that's an interesting question to look into in the future.
Thank you for a very interesting talk, Tracy. I was interested in the pie charts that you showed.
Sure.
And was wondering, in your experience, if there is sort of an optimal level of student-centered versus instructor-centered. Is that something that's specific to a course or a level or an instructor? Or I guess sort of a minimal level of student-centered instruction that you would expect to have implications on outcomes?
Yeah, I think that is an interesting question. So with the terms of the, you know, this is the compass, so in looking at it this way, there are taught we don't look at it in this way, but I really like the way that this is looked at in this way because it provides that view of the class, this nice picture. So you know, I don't think we say like you know 75% should be something not lecture, but we do say that, you know, most of the class, you know, the students are actively engaged and they're not only lecturing. So I don't know if I could prescribe a, you know, a certain percent of the pie chart, but what I would say is like this would be kind of a more, one we would want to emulate more, where there is this diversity and the students are doing a number of different activities during the class, and it's not only lecture heavy, okay, and or listening heavy in the class. So I think what we want to see as a field is more of this, and just less of this in general. And even if we can make progress, like a half, right, lecture and more active learning, you know, that's I mean, we see that as, you know, progress in general.
Any more questions? Okay. If you don't have any more questions, let's thank our speaker again. And